Good evening. Thank you all for coming. It's not the kind of weather which encourages attendance, so thank you for coming out for this fifth installment of the O.P. Jindal Distinguished Lectures. I am Ashutosh Vashne, Director of the India Initiative and a professor in the Department of Political Science and at the Watson Institute. A word about the genesis of these lectures first. Sajjan and Sangeeta Jindal, Brown Parents 2012, have endowed these lectures in memory of Mr. O.P. Jindal, Sajjan's deceased father, who was an industrialist, politician, and philanthropist. The purpose of the endowment is to promote discussion of the politics, economics, society, and culture of contemporary India, here at Brown, of course. These lectures are held once every semester. The previous lecturers include Kaushik Basu, an economist at the World Bank, whose book based on his Jindal lectures 2 years ago will be published by MIT Press next year. The other three Jindal lecturers were Ashley Tellis, a national security thinker, Ram Guha, a historian, and Ashish Nandi, a political psychologist. William Dalrymple, a major literary figure and founder of the Jaipur Literary Festival, arguably the world's biggest literary festival, held annually in India, will be the Jindal lecturer next April. Jairam Ramesh, our speaker today, is a man of many parts. He was educated as a mechanical engineer at the IIT Bombay and then studied public policy at Carnegie Mellon and technology policy at MIT. Since his return to India, he has been an administrator, a journalist, and a politician. As an administrator, he served several ministries in Delhi during the 1980s and 1990s. He served the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, the Industry Minister, among others. As a journalist, he wrote columns for several newspapers, including a widely read column in the magazine India Today. He was also one of the pioneers of business journalism on Indian television, just when Indian economy and television were both opening up in the mid-1990s. In his third role as a politician, he has seamlessly intersected the world of learning and the world of public policy and made a huge difference to India's laws, especially welfare laws. As a member of the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of Indian Parliament, he served the Union Cabinet in the Ministries of Commerce, Power, Environment and Forests, and in his last assignment, 2011 through 2014, as a Cabinet Minister for Rural Development. In this last assignment, he oversaw one of the largest public welfare programs in the developing world, known as the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which he also helped create and legislate. In addition, he was a key architect of 4 other major legislative acts during 2004-2014. The Right to Information Act in 2005, the Forest Rights Act in 2006, the National Food Security Act in 2013, and the Land Acquisitions Act in 2013. It is these steps towards a welfare state in India that will be the topic of his lecture today. Environment will constitute a key theme on Wednesday, and I'll introduce his environment-related work then. Last but not least, Jairam has published 3 books and 3 others are forthcoming. Even as a minister, he was always interested in the world of knowledge and research, and has delivered guest lectures all over the world. Jairam will speak to us for 45 minutes on India's rights-based legislation 2004 to 2014. We will then have a 10-minute commentary from Prerna Singh, my colleague, whom I'll introduce later. We will then open up for a larger discussion and break at 6:30 for a reception. Please welcome Jairam Ramesh, one of India's most impressive policy intellects.
Thank you, Ashu, for those warm words of welcome. I'm a failed academic. I started off my career trying to do a PhD with the same professor with whom Ashu did his doctorate, Myron Wiener at MIT. So my association with Ashu goes back almost 3 decades. And ever since then, we have kept in touch, and I'm delighted that he's given me this opportunity of coming to Brown to deliver these 3 lectures. I come to Brown knowing the reputation of Brown as predominantly an undergraduate school, but there have been some people in Brown who have actually enhanced scholarship in India, on India across a wide spectrum of disciplines. And as I was explaining to Ashu this afternoon, David Pingree, who used to be a professor of mathematics at Brown, passed away unfortunately a couple of years ago, was perhaps the world's foremost authority on Indian mathematics. And all that you want to know about India's contribution to the world of mathematics and astronomy resides here in the Pingree papers in the library of Brown. So Brown has made major contributions to scholarship on India, and I am hoping that with the establishment of the India Center or India Initiative, about to be converted into an India Center, we will see a flowering of greater scholarship on contemporary India. What I propose to speak to you today on is the period 2004 to 2014, the 10-year period, which saw a slew of socio-economic legislation, which, with retrospective coherence, has come to be called the rights-based approach to development. This was also the period which saw 10 years of the coalition government of the United Progressive Alliance. And this was also a period, and I want you to keep this in mind, this was also a period in which India's average annual GDP growth was 7.6%. This is a very important figure that I wish to highlight right at the beginning, because one of the criticisms of the rights-based approach has been that it has actually impeded growth. But I want you to appreciate right from the start that this was a decade which saw the highest rate of GDP growth, 7.6%, which means roughly a doubling of GDP over the last decade, more than a doubling of GDP over the last decade. Now, Ashu has referred to some of this legislation. There were 7 key laws that were enacted between 2004 and 2013. The first was the right to information, which made transparency a fundamental right to information that got enacted in July of 2005. Then we had the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which was a right to livelihood, which Parliament passed in December of, Parliament passed in September of 2005. So the first one was in June 2005. The second one was in September 2005. The third one was the Forest Rights Act, which I will explain a little later. The Forest Rights Act, which gave titles of land to forest dwellers, predominantly tribal population. And this was enacted in December 2006. Then we had the right of children to free and compulsory primary education, or what is often called RTE, the Right to Education Act, in August of 2009. The National Food Security Act in September 2013. The new Land Acquisition Act, which is called the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition and Resettlement and Rehabilitation Act, perhaps the longest title of any legislation passed in the last 60 years, of 2013. And the seventh was the prohibition of employment of manual scavengers and their Rehabilitation Act of 2013. So these were the 7 landmark legislation which grew out of a political agenda of the coalition. It was not packaged as a rights-based approach till 2013. They were enacted as individual pieces of legislation, but as I said, with retrospective coherence, they came to be seen as a package of socio-economic legislation in a variety of areas. Now, the underlying principles of this shift in developmental approach from a needs-based approach to a rights-based approach. This was a transition from the traditional needs-based approach to a rights-based approach. There were 3 fundamental principles or 3 fundamental dimensions to this approach. The first, all 7 laws give legal entitlements to citizens. It gives legal entitlements means that citizens who get aggrieved by not getting the entitlements can go to the judiciary and seek redress. So the first and foremost principle of the rights-based approach is a legal entitlement guaranteed by Parliament by law, which enables them to seek redressal of their grievances through the judicial mechanism. The second principle is that this rights-based approach puts a pressure on the executive. This is not an executive action, it's a legislative action, and therefore the assumption is that the legislative action will put pressure on the executive to be more responsive and more accountable, because the penalties for non-compliance of the legal entitlements are quite severe. And the third principle governing the needs-based approach is that there are credible mechanisms for both social audit as well as for grievance redressal, as I will explain as I go along. So the transition was from a needs-based approach to a rights-based approach, and the 3 principles of the rights-based approach were: 1, legal entitlements guaranteed by law; 2, a pressure on the executive to be more accountable and responsive; and 3, the new inbuilt mechanisms as part of the legislation for both social audit as well as for grievance redressal. Now, let me very quickly give you a telegraphic view of each of these 7 legislation. It's very important. The first, as I mentioned to you, is the right to information. And what the RTI, as it is often called, what the RTI has done has opened up the system, has opened up the administration at all levels. In fact, today you'll find young men and women in India giving you a visiting card and saying RTI activist. I mean, this is one of the fastest growing occupations in India, to be an RTI activist, although it's also a very hazardous occupation, because some RTI activists have actually been killed because they have unearthed scams, particularly in the mining sector. So what RTI has done, it has really empowered citizens to get information from a closed system. And no information is taboo, barring a certain negative list of information relating to defense and security. If you leave defense and security aside, almost all information, including information like how much money does the Prime Minister spend on his official banquets, how many foreign trips does a minister take in a month, what is the expenditure on individual ministers and their houses and their families. I mean, I'm giving you at a very trivial level, but at a more fundamental level, the information that is being sought is about the implementation of development programs. So what RTI has done, particularly at the level of the village panchayats, the local self-government institutions, has put information availability into the public domain, and you really cannot deny this information because there is a very elaborate institutional setup that has been put in place for ensuring that the RTI gets implemented. In fact, RTI became the noose for the very government that introduced it, and there was a lot of pressure as the elections approached for diluting the RTI because there was a lot of criticism that too much of information was flowing into the public domain. But mercifully, that movement did not find political support at the highest levels. RTI continues as it is. So what RTI has done, what the Right to Information has done, like the Freedom of Information Act in the US, has placed information in a proactive manner in the hands of citizens who seek that information. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is perhaps the most ambitious of all these 7 legislations. It is a right to livelihood. What it does is it guarantees 100 days of unskilled employment in public works to the poorest of the poor, to those households who don't get employment in any other area. Remember, this is unskilled employment, it's not skilled employment, it's manual labor, it is labor in public works, and it's for those families which do not have the skill sets to find employment in the modern or the other informal sectors of the economy. Every year, almost 50 million households have found employment under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which means that roughly 1 in 4 rural households has got employment under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, although the average employment created is not for 100 days. The average employment created has never exceeded 48 or 49 days. So what the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act does is it embodies into law a legal entitlement for a family which cannot find employment. The state is bound to give the employment to the family where it is being demanded for public works and in the process create community assets as well. So it provides wage employment, number 1. It provides durable community assets, number 2. And number 3, since it's implemented very largely by local self-government institutions, the village panchayats, in this case, what it does is provides a mechanism for the financial empowerment of these local bodies. And these local bodies, the only source of funding for these local bodies is really the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. The third is the Forest Rights Act. Now the Forest Rights Act, India has about 70 million hectares of forest cover, roughly the size of Texas. Roughly 25% of India's cultivated area is under forests. And about 200 million people in India depend on their livelihoods on forests. They're living either in forests or in the periphery of forests, dependent on fuel, fodder, daily livelihood requirements on forests. Now, what the Forest Rights Act does is it provides titles. It provides not presumptive titles, but it provides conclusive titles on the land which is owned by people living in forest areas, mostly tribals, but there are some non-tribal communities also who are living in the forest areas, and they also go through the process of verification. And if they have been able to demonstrate that they have been living in the forest areas for 3 generations, then they also become eligible for the Forest Rights Act. So what the Forest Rights Act does is it gives conclusive titles to people who are living in forests so that they can continue their livelihood living in forests. In the last 8 to 8 years or so, roughly 1.5 million, 15 lakh, roughly 1.5 million families have benefited. And there is a criticism that the forests would be decimated if you give conclusive forest titles, land titles to people living in forests. But to give you an example, these 1.5 million families have got titles for about 2.5 million hectares. So out of 70 million hectares of India's forest cover, only about 2.5 million hectares, only about 3% or so, is actually being given to the tribal population who are living in the forests to make them partners in forest management. And this has been largely for the tribal community. The fourth has been the right of children to free and compulsory education. Now, it's one of the great paradoxes of India, of course, that we produce international class products of higher education, but we are starved for quality as far as primary education is concerned. In fact, one of the criticisms that can legitimately be made of what India's development strategy is that we have neglected primary education at the cost to the country. In fact, Myron Weiner, many years ago, Ashu will recall, wrote a book that became very controversial in India called The Child and State in India. And he argued that India is the only country in the world that has not made primary education compulsory. And one of the consequences of that is that you may have international class higher education products, but you also have the largest proportion of illiterates, largest proportion of school dropouts, largest proportion of children not going to school. So this, in many ways, the Right to Education Act, which was passed, as I mentioned, in August 2009, in many ways seeks to address that issue. It makes primary education compulsory for between the ages of 6 to 14. But the compulsion is not on the family or the child, but the compulsion is on the state to provide the infrastructure to give the education. And that is the right. The right is that of the child, the right is that of the family, but the compulsion is not on the family, the compulsion is on the state. The obligation is on the state to provide the infrastructure. And this has been somewhat controversial because one of the features of this act is that 25% of all enrollment in private schools should be for children coming from poor and disadvantaged and deprived backgrounds. And this has been one of the big bones of contention. And this is something that is still a matter of debate. But one of the important consequences of the right to education has been the huge increase in enrollment rates, particularly in North India, which has been the area where enrollment rates have been very low as far as school education is concerned. The quality of education is a separate issue, but in terms of enrollment rates, it can legitimately be said that in the last 4 to 5 years, there has been a significant step up, particularly in states like Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, and Bihar. I now come to the National Food Security Act, which is again a very revolutionary piece of legislation, because what it does is that it guarantees 35 kgs of food grains per household, 75% of rural India and 50% of urban India is covered. Almost 600 million people in a population of about 1.2 billion are covered by a food security system which guarantees 35 kgs of food grains, 3 rupees a kg for rice, 2 rupees a kg for wheat, and 1 rupee a kg for millets. So you guarantee a price, you guarantee a quantity, and this is distributed through the existing public distribution system. Historically, the public distribution system has worked very well in the southern part of the country, states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh. But what the public distribution system recognizes is that in the states the heartland states of India, where poverty rates are very high, the distribution of food has left a lot to be desired, and the lack of access to food has been one of the reasons for chronic malnutrition. Not the main reason, not the only reason, but one of the important contributory reasons to chronic malnutrition. 2 out of every 5 children, or almost 3 out of every 5 children today born in India are below international standards of weight and height. And one of the reasons has been the lack of access to food, particularly in the states of North and Eastern India, where the backlog, where the concentration of poverty is the maximum. So what the National Food Security Act does is that it guarantees by law a minimum supply of food grain, 35 kg, for a family at specified rates through a state-run public distribution system. The Land Acquisition Act, the tongue twister of a title, the Land Acquisition Act of 2013 replaces a colonial era Land Acquisition Act of 1894. For 119 years, land acquisition in India was governed by a colonial era law enacted in 1894, which gave the state enormous power under the principle of eminent domain, and the state could acquire any amount of land from anybody at any compensation at any point of time for any purpose. And that was the underlying theme of the Land Acquisition Act of 1894. And what the new Land Acquisition Act does is it increases the compensation for landowners. It provides compensation for the landless whose livelihoods depend on the land being acquired. And what it does is that it says that you will acquire the land only with consent of those whose land is being acquired. So if you're acquiring land for private purposes, 80% consent is required of the people whose land is being acquired. Although for government projects, an exception has been made on the assumption that governments acquire land largely for public purposes. Now, one of the reasons why the Land Acquisition Act had to be changed was in India, land became one of the most important causes of public protests and public movements across the country. Land and forests are the two areas that really are the main cause for public protest and public agitation. And one of the reasons was the lack of adequate compensation, the total ad hoc and discretionary manner in which land was being acquired, and land was being acquired for public purpose A and being used for private purposes. Famous cases in the state of Uttar Pradesh where land, multi-cropped irrigated land, was acquired for industrial purposes but was handed over to private builders. And the additional appreciation of the land was not shared with the original landowners. So in the last 10 years, the agitations, the public agitations on land has been very, very extensive and very acute, and that was one of the primary motivations why this new Land Acquisition Act had to be enacted. Finally, the Manual Scavenging Act. And now this is, people don't talk about this, but it is a fact that even after 60 years of independence today, we have almost 300,000 families in India dependent on manual scavenging for their livelihoods. You have almost 2.5 million dry latrines in the country. Dry latrines means latrines which are lavatories that are cleaned by human beings. And of course, those of you who have had the misfortune of traveling by Indian Railways know the enormous contribution that the Indian Railways make to open defecation, because it's the world's largest open sewer system. 20 million Indians traveling by rail every year, defecating into the open, and that defecation being cleaned by humans. That's manual scavenging. Now, manual scavenging, unfortunately, in India has been sanctified by the caste system. And this has remained one of the big blots on India. And what this legislation does is it prohibits the employment of manual scavengers. It imposes a time limit for the conversion of dry lavatories, which are cleaned by human beings, to wet latrines, and imposes severe penalties on those people who are continuing to engage manual scavengers of some form or the other. So in a nutshell, in a telegraphic form, I've given you the features of the 7 laws. Now, of these 7, with the cataclysmic political change that took place in May 2014, the RTI is not under threat. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is certainly under some threat. The Forest Rights Act is not under any threat. The Right to Education Act is not under any threat. The National Food Security Act is not under any threat. The Land Acquisition Act is under a huge threat, and the Manual Scavenging Act is not under any threat. So it's not a bad batting average that even after such a huge political upheaval that has taken place, 5 out of these 7 laws are not on the radar screen of amendments, but 2 certainly are, the Land Acquisition Act and the Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and I will have some occasion to explain why the change in the political regime has meant a change in the perception of these 2 laws. Now, I don't want to get into too many figures because I want to give you a sense of the politics and the political economy of these legislation. So let me now turn to what I consider to be what are the political economy issues. As I mentioned to you, out of these 7 legislation, by and large, in fact, all these legislation was passed unanimously in Parliament. That's the first thing to recognize, that there was no political bickering in the passage of this legislation, number 1. Secondly, what is important to understand is that these are central legislation. This is federal legislation. This is legislation passed by the Parliament of India. But the implementation of these laws is with that of the states. And this remains a feature of the Indian political system, that Parliament can pass many laws and they can be very progressive, but ultimately the primary responsibility for implementing these laws lies with the provincial, the state government. And if you have a good state government, the laws get implemented better. If you have an indifferent state government, the laws don't get implemented. So for example, in the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, you have a state like Andhra Pradesh or Rajasthan implementing the act very well. You have states like UP, Bihar, Orissa, Jharkhand, where there are more poor people and you expect the act to be implemented. The implementation of the act is very indifferent. So this split responsibility introduces a diarchy into the political economy, and this remains one of the weaknesses of the system, that the enforcement of the legislation is the responsibility of the state governments and the local governments, but the responsibility for actually bringing about this legislation is that of the central government. Now, out of these 7 laws that I mentioned to you, as I said, 2 are under immediate threat, and 5, for good political reasons, are not under much threat. Now, this threat arises because of a very sound political principle in parliamentary democracy, which is where you stand depends on where you sit. So if you're in the opposition, you take one viewpoint. When you come into power, you take another viewpoint. This is not unknown in parliamentary democracies. And you find, for example, that the Land Acquisition Act, which was passed unanimously by Parliament, unanimously in Parliament, now parties which supported that legislation now adopting a different view, saying that the Land Acquisition Act will impede the process of faster industrialization, will impede the process of faster urbanization. Remember, the Land Acquisition Act applies only for land acquisition, where governments acquire the land. It does not apply for land purchase. If somebody wants to buy the land, this law does not apply. If somebody wants to lease the land, this law does not apply. This law applies only if government power is being sought to be used to acquire the land under a fast-track process. So the government acquires the land not only for itself, but the government acquires the land for others, particularly private companies. So now the thinking in the current ruling establishment is that this Land Acquisition Act imposes a regulatory burden on the private sector, and that if you want to go back to fast economic growth, you need quicker processes of land acquisition, and this new act will have to get amended. So one of the big political debates in India is precisely this. Should governments acquire land for private companies? Why can't private companies go and buy the land like they buy land in other countries? Why should governments acquire the land? And if governments acquire the land, what should be the conditions under which this acquisition should take place? So this, in the next 2 months, those of you who follow Indian political debates will be treated to intense political debate when Parliament reopens, when the government is going to come up with some amendments to the Land Acquisition Act, which I'm sure will be resisted by most other political parties. On the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, the argument is that A, skilled employment is not being provided, and B, no assets are being created. And therefore, it's a dole. You're, in Keynes's famous language, you're employing people to dig a ditch, and you're giving them employment to fill the ditch again. I mean, this is, a caricature of the criticism. But the criticism is that you are really not creating productive employment, and in a country which requires skilling, you are spending 40,000 crores of rupees, $8 billion a year, you are spending on unskilled employment. Now, remember what I mentioned to you, that the Rural Employment Guarantee Act is not meant to be a skilled employment program. It's meant to be a program for the unskilled. It's meant to be a program for the poorest of the poor who don't have any opportunity of participating in a modern labor market, and this is distress employment of a last resort. So this is number one. And number two, remember that the Rural Employment Guarantee Act does not have just the provision of wage employment as an objective. It also has the provision of community assets, the creation of community assets as an objective, and the empowerment of local self-government institutions as a third objective. Now, just to give you some figure, to give you a sense of what the Rural Employment Guarantee Act does, almost 65% of the funds that are used under the Employment Guarantee Act are for water conservation, for water harvesting, for irrigation channels, and for water-related activities, water security activities, and roughly about 20 to 25% are for building toilets. Now, nobody can argue that the building of toilets and the creation of irrigation canals is not a community durable asset. The real problem in the Rural Employment Guarantee Act comes from the political economy, because what the Rural Employment Guarantee Act says is that the Member of Parliament and the MLA has no role in the selection of projects. The projects are going to be selected by the local self-government institution, the panchayats. And nothing can irritate elected representatives more than the loss of their power to sanction projects. Now, under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, The member of parliament doesn't decide where the money is to be spent. The member of the legislative assembly doesn't decide where the money is going to be spent. It's the Gram Sabha, it's the collective body of villagers who constitute the panchayat who are going to decide how that money is going to be spent and where that money is going to be spent. And that is a loss of huge discretionary power for political classes at the top of the food chain. But if the bottom of the food chain is empowered, the top of the food chain feels starved. And what you're seeing really is the starvation effects of people at the top of the food chain. And there will be, I'm sure, in the months to come, concerted efforts made to amend the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act as well. Now, let me close by saying that, coming back to where I started, the criticism of the rights-based approach, there were two criticisms. One was the political criticism, that it didn't deliver the elections. And this is a criticism that you hear increasingly, that in spite of the rights-based approach, in spite of the empowerment of millions of people, the coalition government was wiped out in the elections. Now, that assumes that there is a relationship between policies and outcomes in elections. But as I have often argued, Indian election is not a matter of achievement, it's a matter of sentiment. You can have all the achievements to your credit, but if the sentiment for some reason is against you, you're going to come a cropper in the elections. So this argument that the rights-based legislation should be thrown out of the window because electorally it did not deliver is something that I would seriously question, because that is based on a false relationship, a false presumption of a relationship between what governments do and what electors actually perceive that they have done. The second criticism is that the rights-based approach has been hugely resource intensive and has taken away resources from growth-generating processes. Now, that's why I started off my presentation by telling you that the annual average growth rate in the last 10 years has been 7.6%. Now, that's the highest growth rate for any democracy, and certainly the highest growth rate outside China. So a 7.6% growth, certainly it should be 9%, no doubt, but a 7.6% growth coming over a 6% rate of growth over the previous decade is not by any standard, either Indian or international, a growth rate that you would say is below par. So this argument that the rights-based approach has impeded growth processes is simply not born out of empirical realities. The real criticism of the rights-based approach, to my mind, is that the spirit, the letter of the rights-based approach is there, but the spirit of the rights-based approach is not there. If I don't get employment, I'm supposed to get unemployment allowance. But no family has got unemployment allowance in the last 8 years. Just to give you an example. So the penalties for non-fulfillment of legal guarantees, which is the heart of the rights-based process, is not in evidence. And therefore, one of the cardinal principles of the rights-based approach, which is that the executive becomes more sensitive, the executive becomes more responsive, because of the fear that penalties are going to be imposed on the state, that has not been borne out by practice. So enforcement of this rights-based legislation has been very, very weak. And one of the reasons why the enforcement has been weak, I have already mentioned to you, which is the fact that the split level responsibility between the federal government and the state government. But the more important reason why enforcement has been weak is, paradoxically, awareness of these rights has been very poor. So the political education required for making people aware that these are legal entitlements, these are rights guaranteed to you by law, passed by parliament, whether it relates to education, whether it relates to employment, whether it relates to information, whether it relates to land titles, that has been very, very poor. So the awareness, the mass awareness of these legal entitlements being very poor, the enforcement machinery has also been very weak. And that has resulted in a situation where one of the foundational principles of the rights-based approach, which is grievance redressal. You don't have people in India knocking on the doors of the courts saying that my child is guaranteed primary education and I have been denied primary education. You do not have instances of people knocking on the doors saying that I am entitled to employment and I have been denied employment. That has not happened. So to that extent, one of the cardinal foundation principles of the rights-based approach has been considerably weakened. All in all, I would say that this rights-based approach was an experiment in empowering citizens, in giving people rights, in moving a developmental perspective, as I said, from a perspective in which needs, which was based on needs, and rather convert those needs into rights and give people a sense that this is their legitimate due, which the executive has to provide, should have provided, but did not provide for some reason or the other. So I feel that that logic and that rationale still continues. There are many other reasons why this social legislation was introduced. One of the important reasons, which I shall be talking in my third lecture, is the fact that in large parts of central India, particularly in those parts of central India which are forests rich and which are mineral rich, problems of tribal discontent caused by our policies of land acquisition and forest administration has fueled what is now known as India's Naxal problem or India's Maoist challenge problem. So a lot of this legislation has to do not just with providing legal entitlements in themselves, but also have other impacts in other areas, particularly when it comes to management of forests, management of minerals, and now, of course, as you will see, with the increasing emphasis that is being put on sanitation, the law empowering manual scavenging, prohibiting manual scavenging, so to speak, is also very important from the Clean India mission that the Prime Minister has launched. So I have a feeling that these rights-based legislation will continue in some form or the other. 5 out of them will continue as they are. 2 might get reformed, repackaged, renamed, but they will continue because I think, frankly, what people have recognized is that there are benefits to be had from this approach. It certainly provides for a lot of emphasis in the executive that we are bound to do what we are to do because Parliament has passed these laws. And there is also Parliament passing these laws brings a certain degree of political consensus and political unity as far as these programs are concerned. So I'd stop here and maybe take a few questions. Thank you. Should I sit here? Yeah.
So we'll have an 8 to 10 minute commentary on the lecture from Prerna Singh, Mahatma Gandhi Assistant Professor at the Watson Institute and the Department of Political Science and Fellow of the Brown India Initiative. Prerna was educated at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, Cambridge University, United Kingdom, and Princeton, where she took a PhD in political science. She then taught at Harvard before joining Brown 4 months ago. Prerna has already published in leading professional journals. I would not cite all of them, but a brief reference to her book would be in order. entitled How Solidarity Works for Welfare, Subnationalism and Social Development in India. The book will be published by Cambridge University Press, should be sometime next year. The book investigates state-level variation in the welfare policies and outcomes in India, develops an innovative argument based on archival research, field research, interviews, stats, and that allows her, that corpus of work that is emerging, allows her to give us an informed and in-depth comment, though in all of 10 minutes, on today's lecture by Jairam. So, Prerna, the next 10 minutes are yours.
So, thank you all for being here on this kind of Indian monsoony, rainy evening. And I just want to start by saying what a treat it is, and to thank Ashu for this opportunity, because Mr. Jairam Ramesh is one of those politicians that it's a real treat to interact with, because of course he's not just a politician. He's a policy intellect, and in addition to his many achievements that Ashu mentioned, I just wanted to kind of flag his actually very nice ability to put this semantic twist on phenomena that we all knew. And so I particularly kind of really liked your use of the term rurban. For anyone who kind of takes the highway now from Delhi or to Jaipur or any other big city, you kind of you really begin to wonder when the city ends, which used to be something that all of us could tell. You know, it's when the kind of yellow flowers appear and you see these village huts, but you don't anymore. It's this kind of continuous transition from the rural to the urban, and particularly doing fieldwork in Kerala where this is very obvious. I really appreciated the word rurban, and then of course the fact that it gets picked up, everyone talks about it. Another one is China India, which is it's not just China versus India, and then also this idea, which I think every one of us who grew up in India and had to, unfortunately poop in an Indian Railways toilet and have that, slight dizzy effect of the fact that it just goes right down onto this moving train. I mean, it is the world's largest open defecation system, and it's unbelievable how all of us who've been in a way scared to do this hadn't quite realized what implications this has for, I think, huge implications for malnourishment, which are only kind of being emphasized today. So what I'll say, I'll divide my comments into 3 sets of remarks. I'll first just talk briefly about why it is that this rights-based legislation is so important. I'll then offer some kind of brief and deliberately provocative arguments about why it is that we saw this rights-based legislation be passed at the time it did. And I'll finally kind of, question this by saying how important is it really, and push Mr. Ramesh on this a little, and I'd love to hear his thoughts. So, for India's becoming a democracy in 1947 was an unlikely situation. It's a poor, ethnically diverse, largely uneducated country that doesn't really give you the raw material, or so political scientists thought, for democracy. And yet it introduces a democracy and survives quite successfully as one. And yet this institution of political and civic rights stands in stark disjunction with the fact that it does not introduce social rights. So to go back to T.H. Marshall and a very interesting project by Professor Varshni and Professor Heller examines this concept of the extension of social rights in slums in Bangalore. But at the national level, this is really India becoming more of a democracy. So it's this rights-based legislation, I think, important because it's important for the fact that Indians are not just recipients or exercisers of civil and political rights, but also critically social rights. And to put this in comparative context, it's interesting that a number of countries that India gets compared to, Brazil, South Africa, are around this point of time also doing something similar. So you think of Brazil's People's Constitution, you think of South Africa's post-apartheid constitution, and you see that social rights are beginning to figure very prominently. And it's interesting because for T.H. Marshall, who's writing in the context of England, the timeline was that civil rights in the 18th century, political rights in the 19th century, social rights in the 20th century. So India is about a century late, but it is, I think, the beginnings of a very important proto-welfare state. And this is, of course, important because India desperately needs it. Already Mr. Ramesh kind of highlighted the problems of malnourishment. India remains home to 2/3 of the world's illiterates. And of course, this is a problem of the fact that India is one of the world's largest countries. But even relative to where it should be, this is obviously a kind of it's a grave and empirical and almost a grave empirical problem, and it's a question really that this was desperately needed. Also because for a long time, the trickle-down theory of welfare, which was that central planning, economic reform, economic development would translate into a better economic and social situation for the people, seems to have been far more limited than the proponents of this would have expected. So for that, and also because it's been a long time coming, India's constitution famously, we've kind of debated this for a while in the corridors of the Watson, but had this kind of slightly peculiar division between fundamental rights and the directive principles of state policy. So fundamental rights are actionable, just rights that the state is obliged to provide, and then the directive principles of state policy, which is where most of the things on which rights-based legislation is happening today went. But the directive principles were simply exhortations to the state. It's what the state should do. There was nothing actually kind of obliging the Indian state to do anything in the directive principles of state policy, and indeed, until the early 2000s, the Indian state didn't do anything. And I think this is important. I was reading recently some of the debates in the Constituent Assembly of India about how this happened, and it's a peculiar combination of things. Basically, it was a question of feasibility, which then took on normative dimensions. And that's also interesting. It's because basically everything that the Constitution, so there was never any debate about how important these things were. The debate was really about whether the government could do them, and the fact that the Indian government at that point in the early 1950s was not, it was seen that the right to education, which interestingly goes back to the early 20th century. So in 1918, the Congress, which is the party that Mr. Ramesh is from, actually declared that the right to education should be something that the post-independence Indian government should institute. And then the Motilal Nehru Committee report, which in many ways is the kind of basis for the Constitution of India, also specifically mentions this particular right to education. And yet it doesn't become a right in 1950s, and it seems from an analysis of these debates that it doesn't become one not because anyone thinks it shouldn't, but because they think it can't. And so then consequently it becomes the directive principles of state policy, which I think is interesting. There's a nice book by Nirja Gopal Jayal in which he says, economic and social rights became the eternal desiderata, forever compromised by considerations of what was legally feasible, politically expedient, and financially viable. And so it's obviously, doubly, therefore, even more interesting that this rights-based legislation in the early 2000s is basically doing what almost everyone in India thought that the state should be doing in the 1950s, but thought it couldn't. And of course, the reason why it is that the Indian state, the Indian national state, never really had a welfare policy, you might even argue rights-based or otherwise, for a long time, is something that can be debated. And I just wanted to throw something out there, partly because I know that Mr. Ramesh himself kind of has been influenced by Nehru and thinks of him, as do many people in this room, as a kind of very important leader, a visionary first Prime Minister of India, whose vision, arguably much more than that of Gandhi, has shaped post-independence India. And for Nehru, dams were the temples of modern India. They weren't schools. Steel, not sanitation. So there was a way in which we can debate why this was the case, is that not only do these social rights not find a place in the Constitution, but they don't also find a place in India's policy-making apparatus, because you might argue to some extent political elites are not confined by the Constitution, or they might, they decide what to pick and choose and what to emphasize. But Nehru doesn't emphasize, for the most part, social welfare, social policy. Primary education is often pointed out as the kind of most egregious realm of neglect. And so, in many ways, this rights-based legislation marks a huge break from a historical neglect of social rights in India. And it also marks a break from the way in which welfare was provided, which was one of largesse. So when we thought of social welfare in India, it was very much in terms of patron-client relations, clientelism, the 2 rupee rice, the color TVs, or in terms of caste-based reservations. You got welfare or access to certain kinds of rights because you were a member of a certain officially designated marginalized group. So these are interesting because they are not, and it was really interesting how these policies were termed. So in India, there's always been drought relief, right? These were poverty relief. Now the word relief, I mean, there's a certain association of charity with it. which is very different. You're providing relief to the people. That's very different from a right. A right that if you say the government doesn't provide me this, I can actually, I can force you into doing this for me, rather than the state providing it as a kind of matter of patronage, or as a matter of clientelism, but as a kind of relief to its citizens. So I then kind of wanted to quickly talk about, so if we do agree that this is a very important moment in Indian policy and politics, why were these enacted? So I just wanted to point out, and this I think was interesting because Mr. Ramesh alluded to it as well, is that it's really surprising that these rights are enacted at the time that it is. So this is a coalition government. And most literature and political science would tell us that these coalition governments are the least likely to implement any kinds of social rights. So if you look at all the literature on social policy in Western Europe, arguments by people like Ellen Immigrant, John Stevens, more recently a host of other people, John Gehring, will all say that the more veto points there are, the more centrifugal a government is, the more dispersed policy making is. A federal country like India, but in particular a coalition government that represents many of India's regions, is seen as actually the worst case scenario for social policy making, because there are so many potential ways and points at which this can be vetoed. So the fact that this happens with a coalition government, the United Progressive Alliance, is, I think, interesting. Fine, the second thing is economically. So the 7.8% rate of economic growth, you very interestingly pointed out the fact that you don't think that social rights impeded this rate of growth. Now that's something that most people in social science wouldn't even consider, because the general argument is what is the relationship between economic growth and social development. And the debate, usually the kind of conventional wisdom was that you need a certain amount of economic growth before you can put in place social rights. But now actually the arguments are more that you need social rights and basically a certain minimum level of human capabilities in order to have economic growth in the first place. So they're always seen as interrelated. The question is one of sequencing, but this point that actually social rights could impede economic growth or derail economic reforms is, I think, an interesting one. So, was it political? So the political reasons, coalition government, quite unlikely. Economically, it comes at a time when India is growing. Socially, I think it provides a voice for civil society actors for the first time. But what I wanted to kind of provocatively put forward is that eventually, to some extent, these decisions are a product of elites such as Mr. Ramesh. And the role of political agency is not something that social science has had an easy time theorizing. And so, if you kind of take it to some extent, the kind of incentives for elites to do this, why do elites decide at a particular point in time to do this, is I wanted to kind of return to Myron Wiener, who you yourself mentioned, which is, are Indian elites any less elite? So Myron Wiener's argument in a nutshell was that the Indian state has not prioritized education because most of its elites are casteist, I'm deliberately simplifying it. And they have no interest in ensuring primary education because this will be mostly education for the lower castes, and why would you want that? These are the people who work as maids in our house, they're drivers of our cars, they provide our food, they don't need education, so you prioritize higher education because you want to make sure your kids go to a good college, they go to IIT. You don't need to prioritize primary education, and as you can imagine, this is the reason why it was a hugely controversial book, especially in India. But then if you do believe that, are Indian elites less casteist now? Has something changed? I mean, clearly you were influenced by Myron Wiener, as were many of us in this room. So what changes? And recently, I mean, so, India's first official Nobel Prize winning, Nobel Peace Prize winner was Kailash Satyarthi. So, we tried to co-opt Mother Teresa and the Dalai Lama, but the only real Indian citizen who's won this is Kailash Satyarthi. Right, and so it's interesting, there's an op-ed in The Hindu, which again makes use of Myron Wiener, because the kind of flip side for Wiener is that, okay, so the Indian state doesn't want to ensure primary education, it also doesn't want to wipe out child labor, because these are the kids who basically work as, the little Ramus in the chai shops, and they're the ones who make our carpets, and so if you educate them, they won't want to do all these things that are really useful to us. Again, I'm being deliberately provocative and simplistic in my presentation of this argument. But this op-ed basically points to the fact that Kailash Satyarthi has been persona non grata for the Indian government. That the Indian government has actively tried to block Kailash Satyarthi from kind of top-level deliberations, particularly in UNESCO, when he had been independently chosen to head the civil rights movement. So it had nothing to do with the Indian government. It just happened to be the case that an Indian citizen was in charge of this kind of global civil society meeting that UNESCO was heading. And this is an op-ed that it turns out makes a lot of news. It gets sent to the Nobel Prize winning committee. And UNESCO writes to the person who has written this, who happens to be a UNESCO civil servant, to say that the Indian government has officially filed a complaint against you, saying that an international civil servant has criticized a member state, and this is against protocol. Right? And so you can see this still hits a really raw nerve among Indian political circles, the fact that someone is exposing them for the fact that they have tried to block Kailash Satyarthi from very top-level, high-level civil society meetings where he was not representing the Indian government. Now, I know this because the op-ed writer happens to be my dad, who I encouraged to write this article. But it's interesting because of the fact that it gets back to this thing. So what drives this change? So what leads into a coalition government that would be anyway unlikely to do this? What allows this kind of meeting of, is there a meeting of minds? Is there disagreement? Who pushes this and why? I mean, in one way, the Indian state is still, it clearly still has problems with people like Satyarthi, with the broader issues that he espouses, with the Myron Wiener type of argument. So what happens now? And I'll end, Ashu, because I know I'm almost out of time. By finally just asking you, I began by saying why this is really important, and I do believe that this is really important, and it's great that you're here to talk to us. But I just wanted to kind of end by saying, what difference do these rights make? Are they really that important after all? And I say this because of the fact that you yourself brought up this question of implementation. And so you began by saying, you said that there were 3 points that were really important about this rights-based legislation. And the first one that you mentioned is that it is legally enforceable. It's rights. And I think that's really interesting because when you think of rights, to me at least, there are 2 aspects of rights. One, as you pointed out, is they're legally imposed. If I'm unemployed and I don't get to build a dam or pave a road, I can say I need my 100 days of employment. But the second is it's legal entitlement plus also moral obligation, right? And so in India, it's always where the rubber hits the road. So Lant Pritchett has this really nice analogy. He says India is not a failing state. India is a flailing state. And the reason he says it is because the top, people like you, you're amazing, you're tremendous. You look at Indian policy, and it looks fantastic. You wonder why it is that India has the world's highest rate of stunting or malnourishment, but we do, right? And why? It's because not just the fact, and I'll push a little bit, it's not just that state-level governments, because of course, state-level governments are in a way where, and this is what my work has been on, where social policy has been enacted. So what's new is that this is happening at the national government, the states. Some states have been doing this for quite a while. It's said that the Indian national government hasn't done it, and this is why this is new. But then the question becomes, and I'll end with a kind of example which I know might be interesting to you because you're also interested in China and India, which is one of the Indian state and the Chinese state's responses to smallpox in the 1950s. Not a disease we kind of know today, but I think somewhat resonant when we think of Ebola. A kind of epidemic, it's a contagious disease, it's a huge, huge threat. And the problem is that, in China, both India and China have very progressive smallpox eradication campaigns in the early 1950s. And yet, China eradicates smallpox in 2 years. It takes India 16 years. So India eradicates smallpox 16 years in the 1970s. And so when people are talking about the smallpox problem in the 70s, it's basically a problem in India. So then the question becomes why? Because if you read India's National Smallpox Eradication Campaign report at the national level, I mean, it's a brilliant document. So you wonder, what goes wrong? And this is what I want to kind of end with, is that you have all of this really progressive policy, but what happens? So in smallpox, what happens is that in India, they find that these registers, which you use to vaccinate people, are in disuse, such that when the monitors from the WHO go, they find that, Professor Ashutosh Varshney was vaccinated yesterday. It turns out, no offense, he's been dead 15 years. So, it's been the case that basically people who are long dead are being showed up as vaccinated last month. I'm in school, I have 5 vaccination marks on my arm because the vaccinator comes with 100 vials to be distributed to the village and basically vaccinates school kids because they're really easy to find. They're in school. So you vaccinate them 5 times, right? And in China, you do this because the mass vaccination campaign is super successful. So I'll just end with a thought on this, which is this question of moral obligation, but also a question of, how do you get these rights-based legislations to actually not just be a right in terms of people enforcing it, but also for the grassroots state functionaries, the flailing part of the state, to actually do its job. And in China, the really interesting thing is it happens, one, because of a really motivated institution, the Chinese Communist Party, but also equally because even though the smallpox vaccination is a Jennerian vaccination, it's nothing Chinese about it. It was, with cows and Edward Jenner. And of course, the Chinese know this really well. But they basically say it's traditional Chinese medicine, right? They inoculate them on points in the arm where they say these are meridian points. They embed this in a general notion of toxins. And I'm just throwing this out there in terms of the fact that, so the general point is that, you can have rights and you can have laws and you can have policies, and they can be tremendous and amazing and the product of brilliant minds such as yourself. But why is it that India has always had this challenge of this flailing state? Why does it fail where the rubber hits the road? And is there a way in which we as a kind of state are not a nation? And there is a way in which these policies, because they remain separate and not embedded within the people, and that society kind of, I can put this in kind of more political sciencey terms of state and society, but really, do we have a problem in which people such as you and I, people who think about this, people who implement this, who make these policies, are unable to ensure that these policies really reach those people because of whom we have actually made them in the first place? And with that,
Let's summarize what Prerna said. There are 4 points, I think, and let's have Jairam respond, then we'll open up. One is coalitions are according to political science. So here is a political practitioner, here is somebody who made policy. So can he enlighten us on why the basic idea of one of the basic arguments in political science, that coalitions are most unlikely to provide welfare breaks, big welfare breaks. How does that happen in India? We'll all be enlightened by what you say. Second, how does a bureaucracy, or the decision-making class, the decision-makers of India, who are widely viewed as casteist, only serving the upper caste, not the lower caste, how do they change by 2004, 2005? Is it that the new decision makers are not from the upper caste? Is there something changing in politics which is leading that result? That's question number 2. Question number 3 is about Mr. Nehru, a hero of many people in India, including Jairam's. Why did he say that dams were the temple of India, not primary schools? Why did he believe in steel more and sanitation less? What is the argument? What is the response to that question? He was widely viewed as very progressive, and in many ways he was. But why did primary school sanitation slip out of his progressive wisdom? Did it? And finally, the idea that of the flailing state, that we have brilliant policymakers at the top and things don't get implemented. In China, what the brilliant policymakers at the top were doing, they were turning these policies into nationally usable rhetoric. They were turning smallpox vaccination into traditional Chinese medicine. In India, why did that not happen? Why did it not available as a moral resource at the local level?
I just want 1 second.
Yeah.
So and this is that in India, our problem is that, say we want to embed it in society, then our kind of main recourse to this is say Hindu cultural traditions, which then of course I just wanted to end with is the fact that the Congress is a kind of avowedly secular, but is there a secular cultural embeddedness? Is this something that you've thought about? Because our problem is if we think of embedding it in Hindu cultural medicine, then obviously you're from the Congress, this is the kind of...
And this was not a problem in China. China could rely on resources which couldn't be called Han and non-Han and Hindu and Muslim, that this was a problem in some ways in India.
No, I'm just wondering if the Congress, which has this long history, if any party can claim to be a party of the Indian nation, of Indian nationalism, of Indian secularism, it's the party that you're from. And so I was just wondering if you'd had any thoughts about this.
So, Jairam.
Well, very briefly, but I think we need to open it up.
Yeah.
Can I just go there?
Yeah.
Well, first thing I should mention that social movements played a very key role in these rights-based legislation. This was not an elite preoccupation. Social movements played a very important role. And by social movements, I mean women's organizations, NGOs, activists, so on and so forth. So rather than being the product of some elite preoccupation, actually the ideas incorporated in these 7 pieces of legislation which I talked about came from social movements, and they played a very important role. Secondly, of the 7, 3 were enacted in what is called UPA 1, the first coalition regime, and 4 were enacted in UPA 2, in the second quinquennium. But of the 4 that were enacted in the second quinquennium, the homework was done for 2 of them in the first quinquennium. So I would say out of 7, 5 were part of the first quinquennium and 2 were part of the second quinquennium. Now, what was different from the first 5 years and the second 5 years? Anybody, if you tell me, apart from scams and so on and so forth, what is the first 5 years, how is it different from the second 5 years? Those of you who follow Indian politics, can anybody tell me? What was different in the architecture of UPA 1 and UPA 2? Anybody know? Can give me, hazard a guess?
Tell us, give us a, yeah.
Just give us, tell us, anybody?
So not the composition of the Congress, which is the...
Anybody? One guess? Govind? The difference between UPA 1 and UPA 2 was the UPA 1 had the left parties. UPA 2 did not have the left parties. And much as I find the left ideology on economics somewhat antediluvian, one has to admit that the left has been a very important social progressive force in India. Progressive legislation in India the left has played a very important role. Kerala's achievements, Amartya Sen could write books on the Kerala model, and the Kerala model is basically a model of social development which was first institutionalized by the left parties and taken forward by other political parties. The left played a very important role. I mean, no, I can't say this in India because my colleagues will criticize me, but I can tell you this. The left parties played a very important role in the design of the legislation and in putting pressure on the government to enact it, number 1. Number 2, and this is where I disagree with Prerna. Coalitions are far better for governance than single party rule. Single party rule leads to hubris. And no political party is going to be exempt from this. What coalitions do, the process is frustrating, but the product is more enduring. I have worked in single party government. I have worked for coalition governments. 2 coalition governments I worked for. And I found in the coalition government far more, we accomplished far more in the coalition government than people normally give it credit for. So there's something about coalitions, and there is something about single party dominance, which is not good for governance. And I think the argument that coalitions don't deliver outcomes is not borne out of experience. Kerala, for the last 50 years, has had coalitions, whether it's the Congress coalition or a left coalition. It's the coalition. And Kerala today is seen to has social development indicators approximating, in some places even improving on Scandinavian countries. The second point that was raised was on, so the social movement issue is very important. Now, bureaucracy, bureaucracy, there was an Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao, who was asked a question on the bureaucracy, and he said, look, the bureaucracy in India is a trained horse. It depends on the jockey. If the jockey tells the horse to move fast, it will move fast. If the jockey tells the horse to stop, it will stop. So what was different in 2004 was that you had jockeys who wanted to implement this program. And you had jockey which had a common minimum program, you had the left parties, you had constellation of political forces, all coming to this program out of their political ideology. So it's the same bureaucracy that
Myron talked about.
2004-14, the same bureaucracy which slowed down the horse, the horse slowed down between 2009 and 2014, and now you have a super duper fast jockey, and the same bureaucracy is moving. So the bureaucracy is not an autonomous actor. It
Politicians will
to
drive
political signals. It responds to political signals. It responds to consistency of signals. It responds to the strength of signals. And I think if the politicians drive the bureaucracy will perform. This is my experience.
Let me propose the following. Let's say we'll extend this session by about 5 to 8 minutes.
Okay,
we have 5 minutes to go, and we'll go until about 6:35.
So what's the third?
The Nehru question,
Yeah, the Nehru question.
maybe we can take...
the Nehru question, his most famous statement was, the dams are modern India. He went to Bhakra Nangal, and he's not going to say that, toilets are the temples of modern India. He's going to say that dams are the temples of modern India. Now, and to say that Nehru was not, I can produce enough material from Nehru to show that primary education preoccupied him as much as higher education. But what Nehru is known for today is for the commitment he made to set up institutions of higher learning. So I don't think that debate is going to get us very far. But the general argument, the general fact is that there was certainly a bias in favor of higher education. There certainly was. And whether that bias came from the fact that we were all members of the upper caste, that's for sociologists and anthropologists to argue. But yes, Indian planning did not deliver universal literacy, contrary to the directive principles of the Constitution. But remember, Ashul, and this is a point that Myron Wiener also used to make, that countries have delivered on universal literacy only under revolutionary settings. The Soviet Union, China, Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, these are all countries that became 100% literate under atmosphere of revolution. India did not have that. India was a democratic regime where coercion was not the name of the game. And maybe that's one reason why we were not able, even today, the RTE, as I explained to you, the compulsory education, it's compulsory for the state. It's not compulsory for the family, for the child to be educated. We don't have Bolsa Familia, the Brazilian system, which gives cash transfers on the condition that you will educate your child. That's not the Indian system. Indian system is we'll give you cash transfer and we hope that you will send your child to school. There's no compulsion on the family to send it.
Shall we open up now for?
Yes, please, okay. Let's open up.
So we extend this by 10 minutes, right? And then we'll break for the reception. Please go ahead and ask your question. Also, identify yourself, that will be very nice. Yeah.
Do we have a mic?
Do they have a mic?
They have a mic.
They have a mic there. There's a microphone there. Yeah, you want to go there?
At some level, I do find the 7.86% really masking the fact that it was decreasing throughout the 10 years. Might be it was the economic downturn for the world, whatever it was. But other than that, even though the Parliament made rights for people, especially the lowest, socio-economic strata, the one problem with that was that, let's say I was a laborer, okay, and I wasn't getting my 100 days of work. Then, would I waste time going to a court and trying to get my right, even though it was legal? Or would I try surviving? Did the Parliament ever, think of that, while implementing this and also seeing that, the probable legal process for that would be so long for someone to actually get their rights if they didn't get them?
But the Constitution does provide now for public interest litigation. So even if you can't go to the court because you're so poor,
I can go on your behalf.
I can go on your behalf.
Yeah, but let's say in a village, right?
Yeah.
Would there, other than...
Some organizations can represent you.
But every village does not have those organizations. That's the
See, it's an important question. Would I waste my time getting my legal entitlement, or will I actually get work? It's a very important point. But the fact is, as Ashu mentioned, this presumes that I'm aware of my legal entitlement. That is a big assumption. That I know that I am entitled to 100 days of employment within 1.5 kilometers of where I live, and if I don't get this employment, I am entitled to an unemployment allowance. That awareness is simply not there. The investment to make that awareness has not been there. That investment has not been there. And I think that is a failure. That's a political failure. It's because that investment is going to come not only from the state, but it will come from the political establishment. It will come from political parties. The idea that there should be, moment you have a legal entitlement, you have a legal redress, and if you don't get your legal entitlement, what then? That was the essence of building in the penalty in the Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And of course, in the right to information, if I don't give you that information, then there are certain penalties that I attract. But by and large, and this is where the political economy comes in none of these legislation have the penalties been invoked. There has not been any penalty on the state for non-fulfillment of the legal entitlement. And that remains one of the weaknesses, and that reflects, as I mentioned to you, lack of investment in creating an awareness and the weakness of the enforcement machinery itself.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
I kind of want to go back to what the professor said, because I think she raised an amazing point that I don't think has been addressed yet. The practical or the ideological philosophy and the political part of it is good. Like it theoretically should work, but with the population as diverse and dispersed as India, the practicality of it, it's not working. So we'll go away from like the law side of it or like the policy side of it. What are the actual practical methods that you or anyone else is doing in these new laws to guarantee that it actually reaches the people it's affecting? And I do believe that the government should be the ones to reach out. It shouldn't just be, oh, they can come, because the fact of the matter is it's a lot of lack of awareness, and government should work for the people. The people shouldn't have to go to the government.
Can I add to this, Jairam? So the whole idea of weak enforcement overall is qualified by a good enforcement in some states and bad in others. what distinguishes the good from the bad enforcement?
Political leadership.
Well, it's not like for the actual laws that you're mentioning right now, what are the actual practical things that, so away from the poli-sci part of it, just what are the practical, it's like a technical question, what are the practical methods or implementations you are undergoing to make sure it affects the people?
Well, two things. One is the assumption is that when programs are owned by local administrations, the chances of success are better. Probability of success is better. Generally speaking, the assumption has been that if you empower the lowest level of administration and you make them accountable, then people will begin to see their benefits. So this theory, for this theory to work, states where local governments are strong should be delivering better outcomes on social programs. And by and large, this is in fact being the case. Kerala is a state marked by very strong local governments. Tripura, one state which nobody talks about, people don't even think that Tripura exists, in some remote corner of India. But Tripura is one of the most successful states in implementation of social programs. That's a combination of both a cadre-based political party, the CPM, and also a political leader who's made a major investment in this rights-based legislation. So Karnataka, another state which has had good local government. So one practical rule is that where you empower local governments, okay, and you make them responsible for implementation, people will hold local governments accountable. They can't hold me accountable sitting in Delhi or in a state capital. But if I am there in the village, then I can be held accountable and people know the money that is being earmarked for them is being spent or not. Do all of you understand Hindi? Some of you understand Hindi?
What did you want to say?
Let me give you, I went to one tribal village. A very interesting slogan the local tribal gave to his people. I'll tell you in Hindi, then I'll translate it into English. He said, Delhi, Mumbai mein hamari sarkar. Menda Lekha mein hum hi sarkar. Very important, very profound thing. What he said is, in Delhi and Bombay, we have our government. But here in this village panchayat of Menda Lekha, we are the government. Now, unfortunately, this is not a uniform pattern in India. You have some parts of India where the local governments are very strong. Today you have in India almost 4 million elected representatives, 4 million, out of whom 1/3 are women, almost 40% are women. A very large, very important revolution that was brought about by an amendment to the Constitution in 1993, which gave constitutional status to local governments. So where local governments have been empowered, for example, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, where local governments have taken on the responsibility more seriously, you have had better outcomes. So that's one thumb rule that I can think of. The other question that you asked, Ashu.
Yeah. Rajasthan and
you're
saying that local governments are stronger there.
No, the leadership question is very important, very, very important. And where you have had leaders, what James Maynard once called in an article, you may recall, he wrote an article in EPW many years ago, the role of regional progressives in Indian politics. Political scientists pay far too much attention to processes, don't pay enough attention to individuals, to individual leadership. And what makes a difference, our organizations, what makes a difference are parties, no doubt. But ultimately, it's a question of leadership that is provided.
Robert Cohen, one of the premier political scientists of our generation, wrote about this and said, political science has neglected two very important parts of politics, leadership and religion.
And religion.
And religion. And it's impossible to, there are many parts, it's such a severe, he said, such a serious gap that it needs to be addressed soon. The departments that deal with leadership are psychology and business schools, rather than political science or sociology, or which are about
So the answer to
processes,
your question
institutions,
really is,
organizations, classes, etc. Yes, miss, your question.
the answer to your question really is generally governments, states where local governments are strong perform better in terms of delivery, number one. Number two, states where political parties embed these programs as part of their political agenda, outcomes are better.
Miss, yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about...
You speak to the back. We'll lower it for you, shall we?
Hello.
Yeah, okay.
Hi. I was wondering if you'd say a little bit more about the Employment Guarantee Act, because of its focus on distressed, non-skilled based employment. Is there anything in place for implementing skill-based training? Because otherwise it seems like it could just be reinforcing an aspect of the concept.
Answer is no. No, N-O. This is a program for unskilled labor. This is a distress employment. It's a social security net. It's not meant for skilled employment. There are other programs for skilled employment. What this does is guarantees employment for those families who can't find employment elsewhere for a number of reasons.
Right, but...
So it's not skill, it's public works.
Ms., are you suggesting that skill formation for the poor will be a better idea?
I'm suggesting that in such a quickly developing country, there needs to be some form of access of skill if anybody is going to have the ability to make it to the next step in employment. So if you're only giving them access to non-skill-based practical employment, then that is where they will stay.
Yeah,
Okay, so
I can't disagree with you. India needs skilled employment. You need to upgrade the quality of skills. But you also need to deal with the problem of distress employment. You also need to deal with the problem of chronic underemployment. You need to deal with the problem of distress migration. See, what the Rural Employment Guarantee Act has done, three very important things. Agricultural wages have gone up all over India in the last decade. And one reason why in the last 10 years poverty has fallen in India is because agricultural wages have gone up. That's the single most important determinant of rural poverty, agricultural wages. So what the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act has done is set a floor level for wages, number one. Number two, distress migration from some parts of India to other parts of India has come down because employment is now being made available. You know, I went to Punjab when I was a Minister for Rural Development, and I just happened to run into the General Manager of Northern Railways. And I asked him, how are the railways doing? He says, sir, very badly, and thanks to you. So I said, thanks to me? Excuse me, what have I done for your railways? He said, thanks to the Rural Employment Guarantee Act, my revenues have come down because every year hundreds of thousands of labor from Bihar would migrate to search for wage employment in Punjab and Haryana, and they're no longer coming. They're all finding jobs in their own villages. So that's second. And distress migration. And third, where community assets have been lacking, roads, water conservation, and so on and so forth, that has been created. But your criticism stands. Has it upgraded the skills of rural population? No. No. 1 in 4 rural households get rural employment of an unskilled variety. And these are really the poorest of the poor who don't have any skills to find skilled employment. 10 years from now, should there be a Rural Employment Guarantee Act? No. The Rural Employment Guarantee Act is a transition program. It's a social security program. Till such a time, everybody gets skilled employment. But we are now talking of the transition, you know.
So just one
Okay, please go
small
ahead.
question to add on. Is there any way for it to be this guarantee of education and this guarantee of employment? Is there any way for them to work together to create this new kind of skill-based employment for the future?
Well, one of the things that we try to do as part of the Rural Employment Guarantee Act, as I mentioned to you, the guarantee is for 100 days of employment. But actually, we are not able to provide more than 50 days. Only about 8% of all the families get 100 days of guaranteed employment. Now, if you're working for 100 days in the sun on civil works, you must be really hard up. You must be really belonging to the most poorest of the poor distress situation. So what we decided was that if those families that cross 100 days, we will take one young person from that family and provide that person with skilled employment, so that there is some occupational diversification that takes place within that poor family. So there are ways and means of dovetailing these programs to create this skill. But parallelly, I must say, there is a parallel program for skill development and for skill upgradation that is taking place parallelly to the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act.
I think we should bring this session to a close. There is a reception outside. You can continue the conversation there with Jairam Ramesh. So it's time to thank Jairam for a truly stimulating set of reflections and what's almost 2 hours. Thank you very much.